You know, when I think of a brand that I just can't hate enough, I always go back to good old Wizards of the Coast. What is up, denizens of the interwebs? It's Arza Chats here. As Wizards of the Coast has done the unthinkable, they've actively attacked the creator Garry Gygax of Dungeons & Dragons in their most publication that's supposed to be an homage and respect and an encyclopedia on the history of Dungeons & Dragons, instead using it to stand up on their soapbox and shout down to the masses about how offensive the original was and how overly white it was, leading to a response from everyone's favorite champion of freedom of speech, Elon Musk, to call them out on Twitter. Or I guess because I'm being polite this time, we'll call it X. So without further ado, let's get into the articles. Coming from Fandom Pulse, Elon Musk tells Wizards of the Coast to burn in hell over the company's latest trashing of Dungeons & Dragons creator Garry Gygax. Now, Dungeons & Dragons might be the biggest downgrade in history, going from one of the greatest games of all time to one of, well, the worst. It is so utterly filled with gay politics, with DEI initiatives. It is, well, as much as I don't like to use the word woke, it is, in fact, woke. Telling players that you can no longer have half-race creatures because that's racist to have interracial relationships, apparently. Racial differences aren't a thing, even though there's a reason why every single one with a baby mama has one with a man named Daquan. And going as so far as to demand that players should consider making all of their dungeons wheelchair accessible, because that's exactly what you'd have on an adventuring team. A cripple. And of course, that's exactly what every single person in wheelchair wants to play, themselves. Not, a fictionalized, perfected version who takes parts of their personality and turns into something significantly cooler. No, it has to be exactly like you, with all of your flaws as well, including your inability to walk, when wheelchairs in fantasy settings make no sense for adventurers, especially when magic spells and enchantments exist. There should be no reason that you can't fix the legs, either with, magical braces, or a spell to, restore the ability to walk. And if you're really hellbent on not having functioning legs, am I really to believe that you can't summon a golem, you can't enchant a magic carpet, some kind of hover device? The levitate spell is a pretty easy spell to cast. Hell, even if you're going to be a crippled character, you just wear a ring of levitation and you just float everywhere. I think you could actually do something really interesting with a character who can't walk, but you can't make an interesting character who can't walk and is wheelchair bound in an adventure-based setting. Because guess what? He's not going to be able to go into any buildings whatsoever. He won't be able to enter a dungeon because guess what? Dungeons aren't made to be wheelchair accessible. They're all a bunch of burrows in the ground or dilapidated castles. But those are just a few examples of how Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast have been on a crusade to transform Dungeons & Dragons from the fantasy adventuring, monster-slaying tabletop RPG everyone loves into identity politics-fueled social game, evoking a lot of fan criticism. To call it criticism would be incredibly light. But now, most recently, Elon Musk savaged the company after World of Warcrafter design Mike Kern reminded players on how they're mistreating their founder, Garry Gygax. This year, Wizards of the Coast recently released a revisionist history book titled The Making of the Original Dungeons & Dragons, which fans noted was beyond disrespectful to the original creator, Garry Gygax. At this point, I think you need to start taking a shot every single time I say Garry Gygax. I think it's going to be a lot. And the biggest piece of this information attacking the creator is coming from Jason Tondro, who is the senior designer on Dungeons & Dragons, who wrote the preface to this novel. Tondro attacks the original creator's writing. Some language in the first iteration of Dungeons & Dragons presents moral quandary. The documents reproduced in this book include many pages of charts and tables alongside lists of monsters, spells, and magic items. But the game content also includes virtual catalog of insensitive and derogatory language, words that are casually hurtful to anyone with a physical or mental disability, or who happen to be old, fat, not conventionally attractive, indigenous, black, or a woman. Well, I am two of those. I know people who are a third of those, and you can't tell me I'm not the last two. So let me tell you when I say this, none of it is offensive, and you are making it up. I'd love to see the actual words they're listing as being so offensive, because I guarantee you they aren't. Most of them, I'm willing to bet, are completely normal, and the language being used to describe black people, I guarantee you, have nothing to do with African descendant people. It might have to do with orcs, or it might have to do with Dunmer, but it has nothing to do with black people. But these progressives have a funny little thing they like to do where whenever there's an evil race in a game, they just assume it's automatically black because somehow they're not the racists. Tondro continued, some people have charitably ascribed this language to authors working from bad assumptions. In the 1970s, historical wargamers in America were predominantly white, middle-class men. It isn't surprising they would dub a class of soldiers the fighting man, but when the pages of Greyhawk, the description of the Queen of Chaotic Dragons include a dig at women's lib, the misogyny is revealed as a conscious choice. It's an unfortunate fact that women seldom appear in original D&D, and when they do, they're usually portrayed disrespectfully. Well, here's a crazy idea. Maybe it's because of the fact that women, it's a crazy idea, didn't fight in wars. Sometimes they did. There were certain warrior classes that were women in history, and there were some historical armies that were a little bit co-ed, but not really all that co-ed. So it's no surprise whatsoever. And here's the thing. The term fighting man, gonna sound crazy, is a gender-neutral term. The suffix man, as present in this article, it comes from the word human, not the gender term man. In fact, the suffix man for human predates the term man as a gender term. Back then, the gender term was a were, such as werewolf, which is a man-wolf. Similarly, back then, the term for woman was wif, which then became wife. I don't know how that happened, but then eventually the term man was coined and then woman was coined. Alternate theories include the idea that the term woman has nothing to do with the term man as a gender term, but instead refers to a human with a womb man, because the term man is gender neutral for human. In fact, that is something that's consistent amongst all the Romance languages, in which the masculine is also the gender neutral term. For instance, in Spanish, hombre, el, any word ending in masculine can be used as a gender neutral term if you're describing a group of people. It's not patriarchal, it's gender neutral. We are the less special ones because we are given the gender neutral word. The women are given the qualifier and therefore are in fact being risen up by this kind of language. The correct term, it wouldn't be a fighting woman, it is still a fighting man, as it simply means a man who fights. I'd also love to know if the dig at women's liberation, I assume that's what that's supposed to be saying, is, because I'm willing to bet, once again, that's not the case. But Tondro went on, slavery appears in the original D&D not as a human tragedy that devastated generations over centuries, but as a simple commercial transaction. Well, because in a historical setting, Tondro, slavery was nothing more than a financial transaction. It was mostly people of one race selling their own people to another group, or it was a whole group capturing, well, anyone who they could get their hands on. There's a certain argument to be made that slavery was the first traded good amongst humanity. The other one that's frequently raised up as the first is sex, but I figured that was a bit of a given. So no, it's not racist to refer to slavery as a transaction that can impact anyone, because that's exactly what it was. The word slave comes from the word Slav, as in the Slavics, because the Slavic people were frequently taken as slaves by Muslims, and therefore the term slave comes from Slavic. So how about you get off your high horse in claiming that only racial minorities are impacted by slavery? You can't name a single group of people who was not at one point in time a slave. And then of course we had this hilarious image from the most recent core set where the orcs, who they've been, the progressives have been claiming for years that the orcs are black. And they're only given a pure evil morality because they're standing for black people. Somehow I'm the racist for calling that out. So what did Wizards of the Coast do to fix this image? They made the orcs Mexican. Great idea! Now, I've known a few Latinos in my time, and I can guarantee you, not a single one of them want to play as a race whose skin is actually the color of a bean. The cultural appropriation of the original D&D ranges from the bewildering, like naming every 6th level cleric a llama, to the staggering gods, demigods, and heroes, not reprinted in this book, includes game statistics whose sacred figures revered by more than 1 billion people around the world, he wrote, where players expected to fight Vishnu, one of the principal deities of Hinduism, kill him, and loot his +3 sword of demon slaying. Well, that's not cultural appropriation. Are you going to say the fact that clerics are called clerics is cultural appropriation because they were clerical groups? Are you going to say the name druid is cultural appropriation because druidism is a real religion? No. So you're only caring about when it's someone who, isn't white, because you have to get on your soapbox high horse and call out how I am the virtuous Vishnu and no one else can stand up to me. Worship me, minorities. I am your god. And well, unfortunately, Tondro didn't admit to any of this. He instead finishes his preface by writing, despite these shortcomings, D&D has always been a game about people choosing to be someone unlike themselves, and yet you keep demanding that people self-insert, and collaborating with strangers who become friends. It has slowly become more inclusive, and as the player base has become more diverse, the pool of creators who make the game has expanded to include people with a broader range of identities and backgrounds. As these new creators make the game more welcoming, the game has attracted new fans who in turn continue to make the game more inclusive. The future Dungeons & Dragons Dragons, here at its 50th anniversary, is bright. You say as Hasbro's stock value keeps tanking to the ground and no one's buying your core books, to the point where even the new Dungeons & Dragons movie, which by all right was an excellent movie, probably run an 8.5 to a 9 out of 10, and was the perfect example of how you make a Dungeons & Dragons movie, lost money because WotC has killed all fan enthusiasm. No one who likes Dungeons & Dragons gives a shit, and the people who still like it are dirt broke because they're activist keyboard warriors who have too many pronouns to get a job. And yet somehow this game has also not become more diverse. In fact, the polar opposite has happened. While you might get higher numbers of minorities and you might have a wider range of races, if that's what you really consider to be the key focus of diversity, then you're wrong. You are inherently flawed. Because what has happened is there is no longer any diversity of opinion, diversity of thought, or diversity of creativity. Everything is incredibly stale, incredibly boring, and everybody's playing the same two characters. Either the edgy rogue or the horny bard. I would know. I've played in several Dungeons & Dragons campaigns in college, and I even tried running one where the people who I knew all picked the same class, so I made up some bullshit excuse about being too busy to keep going, and I canceled the campaign. The people I know who still play role-playing games, especially Dungeons & Dragons, are all horrible people who are hell-bent on self-inserting and fucking all the other player characters without their consent for that kind of interaction. These people are not actually fans of role-playing, they're degenerates just trying to get their horn off because they're too busy being a loser in college. So congratulations, WotC, you took a game that was actually made for anyone who wanted to play, decided you didn't like it, that wasn't good enough, tried to make it for everyone, and made it for no one except the 2% of the population who have a 40% chance of doing that to themselves. But of course, it's not enough just to have one writer in the book attacking Garry Gygax. It was also Jon Peterson, who penned a foreword for the book. Peterson is a writer who has co-authored Dungeons & Dragons Art and Arcana, Heroes Feast, the official Dungeons & Dragons cookbook, and Heroes Feast Flavors of the Multiverse. The notion of Dungeons & Dragons having a multiverse that they call a multiverse just proves how lost this studio is. In his foreword, Peterson wrote, "Note that the rules for fantastic medieval war games campaigns that make up the original D&D were created and sold to a wargaming community that was mostly exclusively white, middle-class men. The rules compiled here offer little by way of rules for other players, nor indeed for anyone who wouldn't easily identify with the pulp sword and sorcery hero. If you can't identify with that, then you should be playing a game where the pulp sword and sorcery hero is the main focus." Especially before 1974, the rules made light of slavery, in addition to including other harmful content. To reiterate, the disclaimer Wizards of the Coast includes on Legacy D&D content, these depictions were wrong then and are wrong today. This content is presented as it was originally created, because to do otherwise would be the same as claiming these prejudices never existed. And yet somehow, you don't show any prejudice. The notion that slavery is something so taboo that you can't have it in a game or in a story is ludicrous. Slavery is a real thing that still exists today. The Muslim world and Chinese countries and a few countries in Africa are utterly destroyed by slavery in modern times. And by refusing to discuss slavery in any meaningful way that doesn't include discussion over black people who haven't been impacted by slavery in God knows how long, you are actively harming the people who are currently suffering from this real world tragedy. But there is always a silver lining to all these stories, because these people are idiots who like to make as much noise as possible and draw ire from the people who have something to say. Most importantly, World of Warcraft designer Mike Kern, who posts under the name Grummz on X, you guys should all follow him, he's an amazing person, made a thread this week reiterating how D&D has fallen, saying, "D&D creators Gygax and others are erased and slandered at the same time. Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro just released a new player handbook and Dungeon Master Guide, as well as the 40th anniversary Making of D&D book, whose forward slams the original creators and attempts to distract themselves. I spoke with one of the original creators, Kuntz, excellent last name, at 3 Line Studio about the problem. And this led to Elon Musk discovering the post, who decided to chime in with his own passion and expertise. Nobody, and I mean nobody, gets to trash Garry Gygax and the geniuses who created Dungeons & Dragons. What the fuck is wrong with Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast? May they burn in hell. And I don't think they need to worry about burning in hell, because their company is burning to the ground as we speak, as they can't sell anything. How do you take a brand like Transformers and run into the ground? How do you take the biggest girl brand, My Little Pony, and burn that to the ground? With the most recent movie being My Little Communist, and absolutely flopping in every single way possible, how the hell do you reconcile that with the current state of, well, anything? Let's not forget the other properties that I adore that Wizards of the Coast has destroyed, like Magic the Gathering. Once the best player card game, before they made, Commander the dominant play format, the only acceptable format is kitchen table, in which there are very little rules except for the base rules and there is no ban list. That's the only fun way to play the game. But then instead of abandoning everything to do with Magic the Gathering and turning it into Fortnite the card game by having as many crossovers as possible, completely killing the soul of Magic the Gathering and completely power scaling the game beyond recognition, and then going ahead and kicking out every single person who actually cared about the Commander format, overtaking Commander at Wizards of the Coast, and then making it so anyone who is in charge of Commander are forced to sign a permanent no slander clause. What kind of disgusting violation of a treaty is that? And of course, that's not even going into the open license debacle and every other bad choice, because Wizards of the Coast has yet to make a single good choice since acquiring Dungeons & Dragons and deciding they'd rather make it into a video game brand than a board game brand. And of course, the most disgusting piece of revisionist history is when they took the cover of Dungeons & Dragons First Edition and decided that they didn't like the gender and race of the protagonist of that book, or, well, the person on the cover of that book. The famous barbarian slaying the dragon, who they decided, well, it's got long hair, so it must be a woman, because we're sexist nowadays. And look, it's got a tan shadow here, so it must be a black woman at that. And when they recently relaunched this character as a collectible figurine that you could play as, they turned him into a black woman, ignoring the fact that this was the style of masculine barbarian characters of the late 80s. Look no further than Conan the Barbarian. Arnold Schwarzenegger as a long-haired, deep, artificial tan, muscular beast of a man. This is not a woman, even though his skin is dark and he's got long hair. That was just the style of the rock aesthetic of that time period. So it is absolutely devastating to know that Dungeons & Dragons keeps burning themselves even more, but you know what, at this point, I'm just going to sit back, laugh, and maybe make a few videos on it where I can say what I really think. Now, of course, why would you play 5th edition when 3.5 exists, and why would you play 3.5 when Pathfinder exists? And though I haven't played Pathfinder 2.0, and we all know the parent company of Pathfinder, Paizo, has a bunch of their own problems, being super woke and being heavily involved with Humble Bumble, who keeps saving a lot of these DEI-infested groups from going bankrupt. At least they keep their politics out of their game. At least they don't trash the creators, and at least they don't trash people who are revolutionary to the world of gaming as a whole, like Garry Gygax. And don't worry, this is far from an extensive list on every single thing wrong with modern Dungeons & Dragons. I'm going to be honest, I don't know everything. I don't care to know everything, because when I care to know everything, I get angry and I get banned on Reddit. But I'm truly curious, and you guys should let me know in the comments, how much longer do you think Hasbro has with Wizards of the Coast? How long until they sell off Wizards of the Coast, or at least get rid of Dungeons & Dragons, because it's proving to be much more of a hassle than they can handle, and it's costing them far more than it's making them nowadays. And I will see you guys on the next one.